In this lecture, I'd like to begin by talking about how to think like an economist. Economists very often like to frame economic decision-making or analysis as a two-step problem-solving situation or scenario. And we'll talk a little bit about that, talk about what I will refer to as the rational actor paradigm, which is a paradigm or framework that assumes that people behave a certain way and what that tells us about people's incentives and decisions and how it gives us some insight into how people are behaving, but more importantly, why they're behaving a certain way. We'll talk a little bit about incentivizing performance, which simply means aligning incentives for economic decision makers with outcomes or performance that we can observe and creating incentives that create or will maximize the likelihood of achieving or attaining a desired outcome. And lastly, we'll talk about how that alignment of incentives and outcomes might be done at an organizational or firm level. When we think about economic problem solving, let's start with asking a couple of simple questions. Very often, we're analyzing a situation where a bad decision has been made. Now, proactively, it's very good to look at a situation that's working and ask, how can we make it better? But as a pragmatic or practical reality, it's very often the case that it's not until an economic decision has gone bad or something is, either in crisis mode or at least not working the way we expected when we begin analyzing it. And we might begin by asking a few simple questions if that's the case. 1, who is making the bad decision? 2, does the decision maker have enough information to make a good decision? And 3, does the decision maker have the proper incentive or incentives to make a good decision? One of the themes that you'll see in this lecture and throughout economics is that much of economic analysis and economic thinking comes down to issues dealing with information and issues dealing with incentives. Now, how we answer those questions may dictate a certain course of action. It might be that we let someone with better information or better incentives make the decision that's being made. Or it might be that, let's suppose the decision maker is the right person to be making the decision. Maybe they just don't have the right information or enough information. The obvious outcome or direction that would point would be, acquire the right information and make sure that that is in the hands of the decision maker when they're making their economic decision. Or it may be that they have the wrong incentives. In that case, create an incentive structure that aligns the incentives or goals of the individual with the incentives or goals of the organization. Let's take a very simple example of bidding for a gas tract, and in this case, gross overbidding by a company's senior management. So OVI Gas had or was preparing a bid for a tract of land in which they knew there was some natural gas, there were natural gas reserves, and as is common in these situations, they had a young geologist on their staff estimate the natural gas reserves. And the natural gas reserves estimated by the geologist equated to about $5 million. And that was the geologist's recommended bid. So there were several firms bidding for this tract of land. $5 million was their recommendation. Senior management bid $20 million to acquire these gas reserves. And the next highest bid was only $750,000. Now, we don't have a lot of information here, but even with these 3 pieces of information, our economic intuition suggests that there's something wrong. Maybe this is an economic red flag. The geologist recommends 5, management quadruples it and bids 20, and the next highest bidder was less than $1 million. Okay, something smells like not right, but we don't have a lot of information to analyze, so where do we go? Well, a little bit more information here would help us to identify what, if anything, went wrong. In this case, we can ask questions really in 2 phases or 2 steps. 1, why was a decision made? And then 2, how do we fix it? And understanding the behaviors of the individuals involved helps us to understand why they're making mistakes and what we can do to change them. The rational actor paradigm is a framework that assumes that people behave rationally, optimally, and self-interestedly. And while this is not always true, it is a very useful paradigm for helping us to understand human behavior, particularly human economic behavior. Now, what this means is that people respond to incentives, and that ultimately, if we want to change behavior, we have to change the underlying incentives. Again, not always true in every situation, but most of the time it's a pretty accurate approximation of the way economic decisions are made. Let's go back to the example of the geologist and OVI Petroleum. After winning the auction, the geologist increased the company's oil reserves by the amount that she had originally estimated, that translated into the $5 million worth of oil. After drilling the well, however, only a small of oil was actually found, and the geologist reduced by 2/3 their estimate of the oil contained in that tract of land. But management rejected the geologist's lower estimate. They insisted on maintaining an estimated reserve on the books equal to the original estimate, and in fact instructed the young geologist to do whatever it took to increase the reserves or the estimated reserves on the company's books. Several months later, senior management ended up resigning amid scandal. What went on, or what was going on here? Well, it turned out that the senior management's economic bonuses or financial bonuses were tied to an increase in the oil reserves. In other words, their bonus was tied to, or a function of, the company's estimated oil reserves. This created all the wrong incentives. It rewarded reserves and not profitability. It created an incentive to overbid to acquire new reserves, and it created an incentive to manipulate the reserve estimate. Why did it create an incentive to overbid? One of the reasons was because senior management reaped all of the benefit of higher reserves without bearing any of the cost of those higher reserves. This is a third point. In addition to information and incentives, costs and benefits are very relevant in almost every economic decision. Here, senior management's bonuses increased as long as the reserves increased. Nowhere in the calculus was the cost of obtaining those reserves factored into the bonus. And so it quite literally did create an incentive for senior management to increase reserves at any cost. Why? Because they received all of the upside reward without bearing any of the cost of acquiring additional reserves. So in this instance, what was the problem? Was it that the wrong people were making the decision, or they had the wrong information, or the wrong incentives? Well, probably the board or senior management is the right group of individuals to be making kind of a high-level decision about how much to pay for, in this case, a tract of natural gas reserves. So it was probably the right group of people making the decision. And by all accounts, they had as much information as was available, so they had the right information. It really boiled down to a situation of incentives, incentives that were not aligned with the organization's goals. Incentives that created a goal for the managers of increasing reserves, when really the company's goal would only be to increase reserves if it was profitable to do so. Ultimately, the firm's objective, among other things, and perhaps foremost among other things, would be to increase the profitability, not the reserves at any cost. Here's a second example where we can use this very simple economic decision-making framework to analyze a real-world situation that went wrong. National Auto Repair was a large nationwide auto repair chain. And in the mid-2000s, an investigative journalist did an experiment. The experiment was along the following lines. They bought a used car. They had that used car checked out by a mechanic and thoroughly vetted. Whatever was wrong was repaired. So they basically knew that they had a well-running, functioning used car, and they took it into a national auto repair center. They left with a new transmission, a new muffler, and over $8,000 of car repairs. After this story went on the air nationwide, not surprisingly, the profits at National Auto Repair plunged. People were indignant, and demand for their services plummeted. So what was the problem here? In fact, clearly there's a problem, but again, we don't have a lot of information to go on. So how do we, as investigative or forensic economists, figure out what was wrong? Well, again, let's start with some simple questions. Figure out what was wrong, and then figure out what to do to fix it. In this case, National Auto Repair did some of this questioning themselves. And they asked, what went wrong? How is it that a customer with a perfectly fine car can come in and have $8,000 in recommended repairs? Well, it turned out that the mechanics that they had hired that were working at the National Auto Repair shops were being paid based on the amount of repair work that they recommended and performed. In other words, the mechanics had an economic incentive to recommend and perform as much work, as many repairs as possible. Clearly, the incentives of the mechanic were not aligned with the incentives of the consumer. So, National Auto Repair tried something. What they did was they hired 2 mechanics at every particular location. One mechanic was paid a fixed salary, and this fixed salary mechanic was the one who investigated or evaluated and diagnosed problems for the vehicles that were brought in. They were paid a fixed salary, so no matter how much or how little they recommended in terms of repairs, their direct economic incentives did not vary. The second mechanic was still paid based on a commission, but could perform only the repairs recommended by the first mechanic. Now, the more repairs they were paid, the more they were paid, or the more repairs that they conducted rather, the higher that second mechanic's salary. And the idea there was to, again, align their interests so that they were getting paid more for doing more work. Now, step back and ask yourself, what's going to happen in this situation? A number of things might happen. What actually happened was Mechanic 1 and Mechanic 2, not necessarily surprising, got together and colluded, and essentially agreed that Mechanic 1 would recommend lots of repairs, even though he didn't get paid more for it. Mechanic 2 would conduct or make those repairs, and she would get paid a lot more for it, and on the side, they split up those extra profits. So that situation didn't work. Now, was it the case that the wrong people were making the decisions? Probably not. The mechanics are the ones who really are best in the position to decide what needs to be done. Was it the case that they didn't have enough information? Again, probably not. Assuming that they did a thorough evaluation of the car and have the proper training, they've probably got the right information and as much information as anyone else. Again, it comes down to a situation or an issue of incentives. And so what National Auto Repair did was they ended up going to an all flat salary model where they went back to the original scenario where the mechanic who was performing the work was also the one who diagnosed the trouble, but the difference was they were paid a flat salary and were paid the same amount no matter how much or how little work they did. Now, you can imagine that has its own incentive problems, maybe shirking. If they don't want to do a lot of work, they just don't diagnose the problems. It illustrates, though, that kind of like peeling an onion, there are a lot of layers involved, and in this case, there's probably no perfect answer. But all of the scenarios described have costs, have economic benefits, and have incentives. And these incentives and the costs and benefits associated with them are critical in every economic decision-making setting. Let's take another concrete example. A small manufacturing firm hired a VP. And this VP was hired on anticipating or expecting that in 5 years' time they would actually buy out the firm. So the compensation for the new vice president was a flat salary plus 75% of the first $150,000 of profit and then 10% of additional profit after that. The purchase price that they agreed to, that the owner of the company basically sat down and said, I'm going to hire you on, these are your terms, and in 4.5 years, I'm going to sell you the company at 4.5 times earnings. Now, basic question here. Does this contract align the incentives of the new vice president with the firm's goals? The answer here is clearly no. What does the incentive compensation strategy here give the new vice president an incentive to do? Well, the flat salary plus 75% of profits encourages them to dramatically increase profits at least up to $150,000 because they earn 75 cents out of every dollar of profit. Beyond that, they earn 10 cents for every additional dollar of profit. So there is some skin in the game, there is some incentive to increase profits, but look down the road. And this is a fourth idea that I hope it becomes prevalent in your way of thinking. Look ahead and reason back. Looking ahead 4.5 or 5 years down the road, they're going to be buying this firm at 4.5 times earnings. The more they do today to increase profitability and increase earnings, the more they're going to pay to acquire the firm down the road. Clearly, we have a disconnect here in terms of the incentives being presented to this vice president. In addition to information, incentives, costs and benefits, and looking ahead and reasoning back, the last thing I'd like to touch on is ethics and economics. One thing that is very clear is that economics are grounded upon a value system. Economics cannot be learned, cannot be taught, cannot be practiced outside of a particular value system. We could ask, why does unethical behavior occur in an economic setting? And there are a couple of schools of thought. Now, the deontological and consequentialist schools of thought would say that actions are judged either by whether they conform to a certain set of principles, say the Ten Commandments, or consequentialists would say that actions are judged by the consequences. The means may justify the end if the outcome is good. Every school of thought involves values, and it's a really deep issue to go into those and really beyond the scope of this particular lecture. But one thing that's true, no matter what your value system, no matter what wisdom tradition really you subscribe to, one thing is true: your economic decisions are grounded upon values and do reflect values. And one thing that every one of us, I think, should really strive for is to integrate our lives. I think a divided life is really, in the long run, not in any one individual's best interest and not in any firm's best interest. And so as you are thinking about ethics, as you're thinking about economics, regardless again of what that value system looks like for you or what that wisdom tradition is, really a very important question to ponder, perhaps for the first time for many people that they ponder this, is, are my human values integrated with or consistent with my economic values? If they are, that's fantastic, and I encourage you to go deeper with that as this course progresses. If they're not, ask yourself why not, because no matter what your values are, there is a way to integrate those with your economic decisions, and vice versa. And so if there is a division or a disconnect there, again, I'm not, without saying what those values should be, I would challenge you to really look deeply at that, and over the course of this particular course, do everything you can and step back to really integrate your economic worldview and your economic decisions with your human worldview and your human values. And ultimately, I think that's a very valuable thing that can come out of contemplating ethics and contemplating economics for everyone, regardless of their specific value system. Thanks for listening.